grab some snacks and make your way and find a seat. I'm so excited to see all of you here tonight. I'm Diana White. I'm at the Church's Land and Housing Circle, and our whole mission is trying to find out and act on finding solutions to the homeless and housing crisis here in Oregon, particularly in the Portland metropolitan area. I'm so pleased that we have Brandi here today. I think most of you know her, but she is the executive director of Path Home, which grew out of this faith community. In the basement, started this Goose Hollow Family Shelter, and you've been executive director at least 17 years.
17 years.
And Brandi is executive director of the very first trauma-informed shelter for families, design and architecture, and they have a family village campus out southeast Portland off 92nd. And what's wonderful also about Path Home is that they follow evidence-based best practices, which include housing first, having private spaces with locking doors, relationship-focused with wraparound services, and also an emphasis on prevention through rental systems and other kinds of things. It's so much better to prevent the trauma of homelessness than to have to remedy it. She's recognized nationally and locally for her work. I heard that Tina Kotek called you up and wanted to find out how to address this crisis. She's also impressive. She works with 20 other executive directors, give or take a few, in the Portland metropolitan area who all are committed to evidence-based practices in dealing with homeless solutions. And she kicked off our forum series last fall, about a year ago. And then our group met with her again because she is one of the foremost experts in the world on homelessness and homeless solutions. And unfortunately, both last year and again this year, one of the things we heard was, in spite of her expertise, the collaboration with 20 other organizations who do similar great work, they don't appear to be listened to. And you can see that in the emphasis and the kinds of discussions we're having in the Portland area. And they're not paying attention to their expertise. So we see that in the budget, we see that in the conversations. So she's consistently called on informed people to help advocate for what we know works. And so that's why we're here tonight. And I'm just thrilled. We are part of the general community. We can affect conversations, we can help shape policy. And it's especially important time to do that now as we are in the midst of a huge election process, especially in this area. So Brandi, thank you so much for coming. And we look forward to finding out what we can do.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Well, thanks, everybody. Hi, it's so nice to be in this space with all of you and to see so many of you that I've known now for 17 years, for all those years. And so what I thought we would do here today is I have my kind of talking points about how I talk about homelessness and how I advocate for homelessness. And so I just want to go through them and share them with you. And some of you have heard some of this before, some of this will be new, but just really continuously share this information with you. They say it takes 7 times of hearing something for it to really sink in. So go through the talking points and then talk about where might you use these talking points and how can you advocate. When I was talking with Carrie and Diana and some other folks on Zoom a couple months ago, they said, how can FUMC help? And what I said was, you all have a lot of power as a congregation and as individuals who are members of our community. And so when we're making decisions as a city, as a county, you all can stand up and be advocates and share these same talking points and come as a group or as individuals. And sometimes I feel like that just community member advocacy is valued even more heavily than the experts in the field that we go and we visit with the city and the county elected officials over and over and over, and they just are not hearing what we're saying. And so we're really calling on all of you to go to all kinds of places, share these talking points, share other talking points that you have, and be pushing this message of evidence-based solutions, data-driven solutions, thinking about the whole community of people that experience homelessness, and really helping to affect change. So that's what we're here to do tonight. At the end, we'll talk about all the different kinds of places you can advocate, and then maybe think about together, what would you want to say if you were in some of these spaces? So that's what we're here to do today. All right, are we ready? So I am going to try to run my PowerPoint and do my notes at the same time. And so today we're going to talk about, let's see, there we go. We're going to talk about homelessness today. We're going to talk about the history of homelessness, think about who experiences homelessness, learn the effects, the causes and the effects of not having homelessness, and then we're going to look at the proven solutions that work. And so before I get started, I'll quickly introduce myself and Path Home. I am Brandi, and for the last 17 years, I've been Executive Director of Path Home. The mission of Path Home is to empower homeless families with children to get back into housing and stay there. And our roots go back, you all, this would be the 30th anniversary of the Goose Hollow Family Shelter. Yeah, so our roots go back 30 years to 1994, and this will come in just a minute when we do the history, when we opened the first shelter for homeless families in the Portland area right here at First Church. And so today at Path Home, we operate Family Village Shelter, which is the first shelter in Oregon featuring trauma-informed design and architecture. In addition to providing shelter, we also help families move from homelessness back into housing. We also help prevent homelessness for families who are facing eviction. And each year we serve over 550 families. It's about 1,500 kids and parents. We are one of the only organizations in Multnomah County that exclusively works with families, kids, and parents. And so as we go through this presentation today, that's really the framework that I'm coming at you with this framework about the perspective of kids and families who don't have homes. And so we will get started. So first we're going to do a little history about homelessness. Essentially, the history of homelessness is we've always had it in America. We had homelessness from the very first days, the colonial days when our country was being founded, all the way up through the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution. And homelessness was pretty rampant in America. We have records like How the Other Half Lives, that was written a long time ago, and there's a lot of records to show tenement living and really low income, poverty, homelessness. And we had that the whole time we've been a country, except for a 40-year period between 1940 and 1980s, after the Great Depression and World War II, where homelessness, as we know it today, basically went away. And it went away because the U.S. government was investing in creating and maintaining a national infrastructure of affordable public housing where people could live. They were investing $80 billion a year into the Federal Housing Administration. And using that money, we built this national infrastructure of housing where everyone who was living on low or no incomes could be housed. And then in the late 70s and early 80s, our country's public housing system was dismantled and defunded. It went from that $80 billion a year down to $20 billion a year. The result was we certainly stopped building new affordable housing. We didn't have money to build housing, but we also didn't have money to maintain the housing stock that we already had. And that's when the housing kind of fell into really bad disrepair. It became known as the projects, and there was all kinds of racism that went into that we can talk about. So we had this dilapidated infrastructure of public housing, and what did we do? We tore it all down. And then we never rebuilt it. And this has left us with a national shortage of housing that is affordable to people at low or no income. And that doesn't mean we have a total shortage of housing. That means we don't have enough housing for people who make low or no incomes. We actually have tons of housing in Portland, Oregon. There are 6,000 available apartments tonight in Portland, Oregon. They're not affordable to people that make minimum wage. They're $2,800 a month, $3,400 a month, but they're there. And so this will come into the solutions in a while. Spoiler alert, we just help people move into those units. But we disinvested and dismantled our national infrastructure of housing, and as a result, in the late 80s and early 90s, we saw a huge increase in homelessness around our country. That was certainly our experience in Portland, as visible homelessness started showing up on our streets in the 80s and 90s. And cue the Goose Hollow Family Shelter in 1994, when families were being found up in Forest Park and in the Goose Hollow neighborhood. And this congregation said we need to do something about that because this visible homelessness was showing back up. We've seen homelessness in Portland ever since. In 2015, things felt so extreme that the city declared a homelessness state of emergency. And that was 2015, 9 years ago. Since then, it feels like things have only gotten worse. We can look around our community and see so many people living in tents and camping on the streets or in broken down RVs and cars, and it really has come to a crisis, as there are so many people without housing, more now than there were even in 2015 when the emergency was created. And the public looks around and sees all these people outside, and they think this is our homelessness crisis. There are too many people camping on the streets. And that's true. And it's more nuanced than that. Many different kinds of people experience homelessness. At Path Home, we call families the invisible homeless population, because it's important to recognize that while we have a crisis of people all over our community that we can see living on the streets, there are just as many people, if not more, that we don't see. But they're still experiencing homelessness. These are the invisible homeless, the families, the seniors, veterans, survivors of domestic violence, LGBTQIA2S+ communities, people with disabilities. These folks are hiding from plain sight, often out of fear for their safety. Families hide because they're afraid of something happening to their kids. They're afraid that a kidnapper is going to take their kids, or the state of Oregon Child Protective Services is going to take their kids, which is not in and of its homelessness is not in and of itself enough for the state to take your kids. But these parents don't know that. They're afraid that their kids are going to be taken for them because they don't have a home. And so one of our community's biggest challenges is when you ask, well, how many people are there? There's all these different faces of people that experience homelessness. Well, how many are there? Our big challenge is that we don't really know. We don't have great data in our community about who experiences homelessness and how many people there are. We rely on this data source called the point-in-time count. And it happens every odd-numbered year, except during COVID, it happened in 2022 instead of 2021. But the point-in-time count says that about 6,300 people experience homelessness on any given night in Portland. The 2023 count was the highest count that we've ever had here in Portland. We started counting in 2007. The 2023 one was the highest count. We had just in one point in time count a 17% increase in how many people experience homelessness in our community. And this count relies on a team of volunteers who scour our community, and they go out to find people without housing and get some information from them. And that's a really hard thing to do, to go outside and find people and count them. So we know the point-in-time count is an undercount, especially for these families with children who are intentionally hiding from the people, the outreach workers who are going out and doing this homeless count. So we don't have great data, but we do have some data, and we don't use it. So what other data do we have? Well, we have some reports from the Oregon Department of Education. They reported that in the last school year, 4,008 students experienced homelessness in Multnomah County alone. 4,008 students. That doesn't count their little brothers and sisters. At Path Home, for as long as I've been here, 17 years, half of the kids we serve are under the age of 5, so they're not counted in that Oregon Department of Education number. So I'll probably say there's at least 2,000 or 3,000 little kiddos, plus the 4,000 school kids. So we're talking 6,000 or 7,000 kids, plus all their parents. This is 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 kids and parents in Multnomah County alone that are experiencing homelessness, but they don't show up in the point in time count. So what happens is that the city and the county are making decisions about who gets funding in our community and what our policies are, and this is based on this severe undercount that ignores the 10,000 kids and parents who don't show up in the count, and the city and the county focus their resources on the 6,300 individual single people who do show up in the count. Of all of our total clients at Path Home, 56% of them are kids. Over half the people we serve are kids. They are not choosing to be homeless. Oregon has more homeless families with children than any other state in the country. When you look at major metropolitan areas, Portland has the second most homeless families with children of any other city, second only to New York. And 59% of these families who live in our state are unsheltered. They are not in shelter or in some sort of program. They're in cars or tents or on the streets, and they are hiding so that no one sees them. The reason that we have so many families with children who experience homelessness in Oregon is because we do not invest in providing services to kids and families across our state like we invest in other populations who experience homelessness. The Joint Office on Homeless Services is Multnomah County's funding, policy, coordinating organization that does all the homeless services in our community. They have $375 million a year budget. Only 6% of that budget goes to families with children. But I would argue that families with children are the most vulnerable population, but they're also a population that we could relatively quickly end homelessness for. These parents are highly motivated to get back into housing. They want to be good parents. Are they struggling? Absolutely, but they care about their kids, they want to be a good parent, and they want to have a stable life for their families. If we directed resources to families with children, we could relatively quickly end homelessness for them and knock Portland out of that second place for having the most homeless families with children in our country. And so that's what we really need to do. I will say too that, when we're talking about the visible homeless that are downtown that we're seeing out on the streets, I hate to say it this way, but I do a lot. The homeless children of today are the chronically homeless adults of the future. And if we don't do something for their families now and get these kids out of homelessness and get them into a stable home where they can participate in school and take advantage of opportunities, we are just, they call it inflow. People who become homeless are inflow. People who move into housing are outflow. We're going to have constant inflow for the next many decades if we don't address these kids who are experiencing homelessness now. The number one most predictive factor for whether you will experience homelessness in your life is if you have experienced it before. And so all of these kiddos, we are setting them up for these lives of experiencing homelessness. So what is the cause of homelessness? Well, it's varied and it's complex, but basically the causes of homelessness boil down to people experience homelessness because housing is really expensive and jobs don't pay enough. The laws of economics tell us that when supply is low, and supply is low, right, because we tore down our infrastructure of housing and then we never rebuilt it. So when supply is low, but demand is high, what happens to price? Price goes up. That's right, and that's exactly what's happening in Portland and across America. Housing is considered affordable if it costs 30% of your income or less. The average two-bedroom apartment in Portland is about $1,600 a month. So if that's going to be affordable and only cost 30% of someone's income, they would have to make $57,000 a year, about $27 an hour. But we know that full-time minimum wage earners bring home about $30,000 a year, $15 an hour. So in order for a minimum wage earner to find an apartment that was affordable on their income, they would have to find a home that costs around $800 a month. And if any of you know where we can find an apartment for $800, call me on my personal cell phone immediately, because it's just not a reality in our community. Minimum wage earners have to work almost 90 hours a week just to afford a basic two-bedroom apartment. It's nearly impossible for people to make ends meet when they work minimum wage jobs or when they're just on benefits like Social Security disability or Social Security or temporary aid for needy families. If one thing goes wrong in these tight household budgets, like car trouble or an unexpected medical bill, people lose their housing. And when you add in the cost of childcare and the general expense of raising kids, that adds extra stress to these already tight budgets. Minimum wage earners bring home about $2,000 a month after taxes. So let's do the math. Let's subtract the cost of housing, $1,600. Let's subtract the cost of childcare, which is on average $1,000 per month per kid. And we're negative $600 before we have spent any money on food, utilities, gas, bus passes, school supplies, school activities, anything. And you can see how impossible it is for families to make ends meet, so they end up losing their housing and they experience homelessness with their kids. So what about things like drug abuse, mental illness, and poverty? Are those also root causes of homelessness? There's this really great book that I encourage you all to read called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. It examines many of these so-called root causes of homelessness to see if any of them are, in fact, causing homelessness. They went around the country and they tried to correlate rates of homelessness with any of these root causes. So they went to places like Detroit and they said, is it poverty that causes homelessness? Because Portland and Seattle are pretty relatively low poverty communities. Detroit is the most impoverished city in our country. So if poverty causes homelessness, Detroit should have tons of homelessness. But they don't. They barely have any homelessness. So there was no correlation between homelessness and poverty. They also looked at things like drug addiction. If drug addiction is the cause of homelessness, then in places where there's a lot of addiction, we should have a lot of homelessness. So they went to West Virginia, the center of the opioid crisis, and they looked to see, are there lots of people who experience homelessness in West Virginia? And again, the answer is no. West Virginia has very low rates of homelessness. They went around and examined mental illness, weather, in-migration, political leaning, availability of services, all of these things that we hear folks say, well, Portland just has more homeless people because we have available services. Portland just has more homeless people because of the weather here is much more mild than it is in somewhere like Minneapolis. None of those things were correlated anywhere across the country with rates of homelessness. There were only two that correlated. One is rent price, and the other is vacancy rate. When rent is expensive, there's lots of homelessness. When the vacancy rates are low, meaning there's not a lot of available apartments, there's a lot of homelessness. Those are the only two things where we have a high median rent and a low vacancy rate, so we are seeing lots of homelessness in Portland, Oregon. And what they discovered through this big, huge nationwide analysis is that rather than being the root cause of homelessness, vulnerabilities like poverty, drug addiction, and mental illness, they're predictors for who in a community with high rent and low vacancy is going to experience homelessness. So when we look around, we see people who have persistent mental illness, we see people who have substance abuse challenges, we see people who have experienced lifelong generational poverty, but because those are the folks that are community who will experience homelessness. Those are the predictive factors for who in Portland will lose their housing. The other thing that I don't have a lot of time to go into tonight, but we could have a whole nother session, another cause of homelessness, severe and persistent racism is one of the main causes of homelessness. We have a racial wealth gap in this country that we have intentionally and systematically created by denying people the opportunity to own housing. We've had gentrification, we've had redlining, we've had displacement, discrimination in the housing industry, and we have been left with a situation where the average white family passes about $140,000 between generations, and the average black family passes $7,800 between generations. And that's because white folks have been supported in owning homes and property and accumulating wealth, and black families have been intentionally and systematically denied that same opportunity. So causes of homelessness: housing is too expensive, there's not enough income, and racism. So then let's switch gears and talk about the effects of homelessness. What happens in the brain when someone experiences something as stressful as homelessness? So we're going to do a little bit of neurobiology tonight. When anybody's brain is exposed to any stress, our brains release chemicals to help us get through that stress. If it's positive stress, eustress, then you're maybe things like starting a new job, a big presentation at work, finals week at school is very stressful. When it's positive motivating stress, your brain releases chemicals that help you deal with that stress, and they promote things like emotional regulation, critical thinking, logical thought, rationality. Maybe you can think of a time when you were like super nervous to go up and speak in front of someone, or super nervous about a meeting you were having, and then you went in and you just like nailed it. You were like, whoa, I was on fire there. That's your brain chemicals coming out in a stressful situation and like propelling you with all of these great brain responses. But then there's another kind of stress, negative stress, toxic stress, distress. And when you experience distress, the brain responds with different chemicals that put you into what I call survival mode, because it helps make sure that you survive whatever dangerous stress you're confronted with. And when you're in survival mode, your brain releases a different set of chemicals that turn off your prefrontal cortex. They turn off the part of the brain that's responsible for our uniquely human brain functions. Things like critical thinking, language, reading comprehension, logic, rationality, emotional regulation, all of our executive functions, all of those things that are those uniquely human brain functions. And when you're in a distressed, negative stress response, your prefrontal cortex is unplugged and offline. And it's not like if you just tried really hard, you could bring your brain back online. There's a chemical reaction that is preventing that brain from coming online. You're left in survival mode. That's the fight, flight, or freeze system that leaves you on high alert, ready for danger. And that's really helpful, like when there's a wild animal running at you and you think that you're gonna be eaten. Your brain turns off your thinking mode, you go into survival mode, and you are able to fight that bear or run away from it or outsmart it. Or it's like when your kid is trapped underneath a car and you hear of like superhuman strength to lift the car off that kid. Those are all your survival mode chemical brain response. And they are helpful to momentarily turn off your brain to save your life. But survival mode is also triggered in response to negative stress like abuse, domestic violence, and homelessness. Losing your home triggers your brain to respond in the same way that a wild animal running at you in the wild does. And when you experience homelessness for several days, weeks, months, or years, your brain stays in survival mode that whole time. Survival mode stops being this momentarily life-saving thing, like when the kid is trapped under the car, and it starts being maladaptive. It turns into a trauma, where the brain is so overwhelmed with negative stress chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline that it actually starts to rewire the brain so that it's always in a stress response. Even when there's nothing to be afraid of, the brain stays in stress response, keeping you in survival mode. You believe danger is right around the corner. You're hyper-vigilant about scanning the environment to find where is the wild animal, where is the danger going to come from next. That's all you can think about. So as a result, you have difficulty with decisions, you can't concentrate, your brain doesn't work in quite the way that you expect it to. They say you can only understand every third word that's said to you. You don't have any reading comprehension, you can't learn new skills. And these things happen because your brain is releasing chemicals that put you into this hypervigilant state, always looking for that life-threatening emergency that's right around the corner. This overactive stress response that the brain starts rewiring itself into being makes the world seem very scary and confusing. Things that used to make sense, tasks you used to be able to do, you're not able to do anymore. And you start to lose hope of ever being able to understand what's going on. You can't understand the rules in a shelter, so you get kicked out, and you don't understand why, which then just makes your self-doubt and your depression worse. And of course, it's not easy to be a parent when you're in survival mode. You don't have control over your emotional regulation, so you might have outbursts. You might yell at your kids. It might look like you're having a mental health crisis, or you're on meth because you're so hypervigilant and yelling and screaming. Or you might dissociate and have a glazed over look in your eye and not even want to help your kid when they fall and get hurt. This is also where domestic violence can come in. People are in fight mode. Fight, flight, or freeze means that you are in fight mode, you are in freeze mode, or you are flighting, you are leaving. And so people are in fight mode and they hit their partners or they hit their kids. They don't want to, but it comes out of this non-logical, irrational, unregulated fight, flight, or freeze response. Prolonged exposure to this kind of stress response, oh, come on, PowerPoint, there we go. Prolonged exposure to this kind of stress response leads to really bad adverse health outcomes. You're more likely to get lung cancer and hepatitis and heart disease like COPD. You're 4 times as likely to develop depression, and you're 12 times as likely to die by suicide. When kids experience long-term survival mode, it's called an adverse childhood experience. It disrupts their development in every single realm. They can't potty train or develop language skills, and even once they do, they often regress back when they experience homelessness. Because kids are in survival mode, they don't understand the world around them, so they act out, they struggle in school, they have a hard time making friends, they report really high rates of depression and anxiety. And because of that, then they engage in health risk behaviors, things like criminal activity, intravenous drug use, early sexual activity. These behaviors result in disease and disabilities, which results in early death. Ultimately, prolonged exposure to this kind of stress response leads to early death. The average lifespan of someone who experiences homelessness is 49 years old. But this can all be prevented, right? If we make sure that no kids or families ever have to experience homelessness. And so on that note, we'll pivot to talking about solutions. And I want to frame the solutions to homelessness in the context of Path Home's data-driven, proven model that works. So for 30 years, with all of y'all's help, we have been supporting families, we have been tracking outcomes, and we have been innovating new programs. We gather data about what we do, and we adjust our programs based on what works and what doesn't work. We get feedback from the families that we serve, and we do what they tell us that they need. And even if we just did that as a community, gathered data, looked at what works and doesn't work, and made decisions about how to move forward, that would be a miracle. We don't do that as a community. And so Path Home works in 3 main areas. I'm going to skip that. First of all, if you were to ask me the real solution to homelessness, it's preventing it before it ever even starts, especially when it comes to kids, because as I said, that #1 most predictive factor for whether you will experience homelessness is if you have experienced it before. And in Path Home's prevention program, families who are about to lose their housing because of an eviction get help keeping their homes, and they never have to experience homelessness in the first place. That prevents all of that survival mode trauma stuff that we just talked about. Doesn't even happen. The kids oftentimes don't even know that they're about to lose their housing. And so that's a really great thing. We're preventing those adverse childhood experiences. But prevention is also the most cost-effective solution. On average, Path Home invests about $3,000 per household to prevent homelessness before it starts, compared to about $15,000 to help a family move from homelessness to housing. And in Portland, an average shelter stay at an average Portland area shelter is between $20,000 and $40,000 per person. Many of the Safe Rest Village kind of shelters that you see around, they cost $4,000 per month per pod or tent. And so when you look at the cost breakdown, not only are we preventing all the crisis and the trauma and the displacement and the adverse childhood experiences, we're also providing the most cost-effective programming as well. So I can't say enough, we need to prevent homelessness. Oregon is right now in the middle of an eviction crisis. We have more evictions today in the month of October 2024 than we did even before COVID. The evictions are skyrocketing. There were some programs during COVID to prevent evictions. There was some moratorium on evictions. Those have all ended, and folks are being evicted at record rates. When people do lose their housing, when we can't prevent homelessness and people lose their housing, shelter can be an important part of the continuum. Path Home operates Family Village Shelter, which has 17 private spaces for homeless families with children. The spaces have locking doors and real furniture. This is what the rooms look like if you haven't been out there. The families have private spaces where they can be. Ends up being about 75 kids and parents a night that stay in shelter. And families have access to all kinds of common spaces. And I just have some pictures here. We have a library, we have a computer lab, a little kids' play area. We have lots of living spaces for the families where they can really come and watch Netflix or play video games. We have a central kitchen and dining room where we do 3 meals plus snacks a day. We have playground and a basketball court and a community garden and so much more at Family Village. And as I said, Family Village is the first shelter in Oregon that features trauma-informed design and architecture. This is a kind of design, it's an evidence-based proven model that helps people heal from that crisis and trauma of homelessness, and it leads to better outcomes in shelters. Things like shorter shelter stays and greater success moving into housing. At Family Village, 90% of the families that we serve move into housing when they leave shelter. The average shelter stay is only about 3 months for families. And we credit this success to implementing another evidence-based practice of certainly the trauma-informed design, but also housing first. Once housed, 87% of the families that Path Home helps move into housing, they keep their housing for good. 87% keep their housing for good. And that's where this evidence-based practice of housing first comes in. Even for the hardest to house individuals with the highest vulnerability rates, the highest, the jargon term that they use is acuity, the highest acuity, housing first works if it's implemented to fidelity. And so housing first has three components. First of all, we want to minimize the amount of time that someone experiences homelessness, and we want to help them quickly move back into housing. 2, we want to provide rent assistance, a combination of short-term and/or long-term rent assistance to help people stabilize, and depending on what the need of the family is, determines how much rent assistance they get. And those first two components, that's what our city and our county are funding here in Multnomah County. And they say, you know what, we don't have an 87% success rate. Not all the people that we house are successful in housing. So housing first just must not work. And I'm starting in the last month or month and a half to hear people say, we don't do housing first around here. We do shelter first in Portland. Well, first of all, shelter first is not a thing. That is a made-up string of words that don't go together. Housing first is an evidence-based model that has 40 years of worldwide data to support it. But there's a third component to it, and it's the most important component, and it's the part that our city and our county do not fund. And that's providing long-term, relationships-based case management to help families address and deal with whatever is going on in their lives that led to homelessness. And when implemented to fidelity, when we do all three components of housing first, there is worldwide data to show that this model works even for the people who have severe and persistent mental illness, even for the people that have addiction issues, and even for the people that have both mental health and addiction. But it's housing first, it's not housing only. We have got to provide those robust services to people so that they have support to keep their housing for good. And so going back to those 6,000 available apartments tonight in Portland, Oregon, we are spending $20,000 to $40,000 per year to shelter people. We could rent one of these $3,000 a month apartments, help people move into these units, and then provide really intensive services to help them stay there. Some people are going to need multiple times a day. Some people are going to need folks to come make sure they're taking their meds. Some people are going to need monthly visits and everything in between. But if we used the 6,000 apartments that we have tonight, we could say things like, no more camping, you guys. Like, we're not going to arrest you. I don't want to get into the arrest game and do all of that, but we could say, we have a home for you, or you can't be here. Like, we can't do the camping. Let's move people into homes, give them the support that they need, and relatively quickly, we could make a huge, gigantic dent in homelessness in Portland. Houston has reduced homelessness by 50% over the last 10 years. They don't do shelter in Houston. They don't have shelters in Houston. They move everyone from the streets back into permanent housing. In Santa Clara County, California, Silicon Valley area, they do the same thing. They have camps with 160 people living under the freeways, kind of like we have here, right? And they take 160 of those people, they move them directly into permanent housing. They move them together, so they're all in the same building or the same couple blocks from each other, so they have that community that they've built. And they provide intensive supportive services to those families. Or those are not even families, those are individuals. 18 months later, 93% of them are still housed. And this goes to show that the housing first model can work. It can work in places like Houston and Silicon Valley, and it can work here in Portland. And Path Home is a great example of showing that. The way that we do it is that we fund these long-term supportive services so people can truly end homelessness for good. And these interventions have to happen once people are in housing, right? Because if they're not housed, their brain is still going to be in survival mode. They're not going to have access to that prefrontal cortex, the critical thinking, logical, rational part of the brain, and they're not going to be able to benefit from the services in the same way that they are once they're housed and they're out of that survival mode brain response. So just really fast, I couldn't be here and talk with you all if I didn't talk about Path Home's plans for the future. We are continuing to be an innovator in homeless services, and we're creating a one-stop shop for families where they can come get all the tools, the resources, and the relationships that they need to end homelessness for good. We already own 1.5 acres of land out in Lentz. That's where our Family Village campus is. And we plan to build 2 new buildings on our campus. We'll keep our Family Village shelter, beloved, of course, and then we'll build 40 units of permanent housing for families, all 2 and 3 bedroom. And then we'll also build a 3rd building that will be a wraparound services center. We're gonna have all the services that families tell us they need right there on our campus. And families have said that they need mental health care, domestic violence intervention, employment training, and child care. We call this our moonshot. This will be the first kind of center like this in Portland, and we're really excited to implement the model that we know works and that will end homelessness for thousands of families in Portland. Okay, so our key takeaways today. If you all remember anything, and if you're going to be out there advocating, homelessness is a housing problem. Drug addiction, mental illness, and other factors are predictors of who will experience homelessness in a community, but they are not root causes themselves. Our community is using a very limited data set to make our funding and our policy decisions. We use the point in time count, and now folks are using the Built for Zero infrastructure, but neither of those tools capture the thousands of kids and parents who experience homelessness. We need to broaden our data set and use other data like the Oregon Department of Education data to fully understand the scope of how many families don't have homes right now. And then we need to dedicate our resources to the solutions that work. The Housing First model works, but if and only if it's implemented to fidelity, and we're doing all 3 parts. We know how many kids and parents are out there, and we have got to prioritize families with children in the city and the county. These kids and families are not choosing to be homeless, and neither are their parents. Lots and lots of parents work even while they're in shelter, and they just want to make a good life for their kids with the right level of support. Okay, so where can you advocate? This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but this is just some places I came up with. The city and the county commissions have meetings every single week. They always have public testimony available at the beginning of the meeting, and there are often times when you can sign up to provide testimony on the issues that they're discussing. Show up to them. If 1 or 2 or 3 of you showed up to every city and county board meeting and you were given these talking points and making these, like the squeaky wheel gets the squeaky voice gets the wheel, or whatever that is. The squeaky wheel gets something. But if you all were showing up there, I mean, I think unlike me showing up, it's like, okay, there's Brandi again. But it's the Methodist Church is coming. Like, you all are taxpayers, you're voters, you're citizens. You have this different level of power and influence than I do as a person who's paid to do this work. Bring these messages to budget hearings. The county budget process happens each spring, and there are multiple opportunities to engage in providing feedback. You can go and talk about the resources being devoted to Housing First, resources being devoted to shelters that are trauma-informed, resources going to kids and families. There are all kinds of community meetings on homelessness. If you go to the Joint Office on Homeless Services website, you'll see all the different forums. It's exhausting to go to all of them. Again, show up, ask questions, provide testimony, make comments. Right now in our election season, there are gobs of candidate forums. Everybody and their brother is doing a candidate forum. OPB, K2, City Club, Urban League, Impact Northwest, and those are just some of the ones I'm going to. There are so many more. Show up at these candidate forums and ask them questions like, how are you maximizing getting people out of homelessness into housing? How quickly are people being connected with services? What's the accountability? Do you know about all of the different populations that experience homelessness? Do you know how many families there are? And ask them these really tough questions. Always letters to the editor are a great idea at the Oregonian or the Willamette Week, or putting something up on OPB. It's kind of like a time-tested tool, but it works, and people really take those to heart. You can talk with your friends and your family and your neighbors and your community members and the people that go to the other parents at your kids' schools and the other folks that are part of your communities and clubs, and just be talking about this with everybody. When I'm at a party, I'm like, don't ask me what I do unless you really want to hear what I do. Because I can't resist, I'll tell you. Share with the larger FUMC community, and let's empower this huge group of folks that I know are so passionate about housing and homelessness issues and have been for 30 years. Let's empower this group to go out and make change in our community. And I'm sure that there are so many other places you all can think about too. Okay, well, that is what I had prepared. I could keep going, but I'm not going to. So what comes up for you all? What questions do you have? What ideas for where can you advocate? What messages do you want to bring forth? Now we can just kind of have more of a dialogue and a discussion to hear from you all.
Question.
Yeah.
Do you see this subject matter at all coming up among the candidates for city council and mayor?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the hot button topics. Yeah. At every single candidate forum I've been to, this homelessness comes up.
I have a question about the 40 units you're anticipating, but do you have a ballpark figure about how that money, you could get it, and are you eligible for metro bonds, and could we go for a state carve-out through the legislature? Yes,
yes, and yes. So for our housing, so the whole project is going to cost, I can't believe I'm about to say this, about $40 million to build these two buildings. About half of that will come from the state of Oregon through Oregon Housing and Community Services, which is our state's funding and financing agency to build affordable housing. And we're going to be using some permanent supportive housing capital fund dollars, and then 4% low-income housing tax credits if you're real wonky and you want to know exactly what source is. And then we are going to be going to the legislature to ask for an appropriation. That's somewhere that you all could seriously lean in and help. And then we're going to be running a capital campaign and asking the Joint Office on Homeless Services for some funding as well. So yes, lots of opportunities there.
I live in Washington County, so I'm not going to be influential in Oklahoma, but I think Kate Lieber is budget chair this next year.
Yeah.
And she's my state senator.
See?
That's what I was thinking.
Perfect. Yes, Cheryl. And this is exactly, so what we've also been told about going to the legislature and seeking an appropriation is, I got it now, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? And so we have got to be calling our legislators and just path home, do the Family Village campus, do the Family Village campus. And if enough of us do that, then what I hear is that there's much more of a likelihood to get funded.
In an overall state budget, $40 million is not a lot.
I know. And we, exactly.
It's budget dust.
Exactly.
But you could do a lot with it.
I know. Yeah.
Are there any particular people who are open to adding these wraparound services? Or how do we,
Legislators?
or I'm thinking the city too, the county is supposed to fund this kind of thing, right?
Yes, and this is what is so interesting to me. So we have the Joint Office on Homeless Services. I was around at Path Home when the Joint Office was created. And it was created intentionally. Before we had the Joint Office, the city, well, I'll go back even before then. So do you all know what community action agencies are? Every county in Oregon has a community action agency, which is the agency that's supposed to deal with all of the community services, homelessness, housing, all those things, mental health, domestic violence, and every county in Oregon has a community action agency that oversees that work, except for Multnomah County. And about 30 years ago, Multnomah County decided to disband our community action agency and kind of arbitrarily divide the duties up between the city and the county. So the city got single men and women homelessness. The county got youth, families, and domestic violence. And they operated in these silos for decades, probably about 2.5 decades. And then we said, this doesn't make any sense that we're funding and coordinating and convening homeless services between two different jurisdictions. So let's make a joint office on homeless services. That's the city and the county coming together. We'll put all the money together, all the policy together, and we'll have this joint office. And we did that. And then somewhere in the last 8 years, people forgot that we did that, and they just consider it the county's job. But it's not the county's job. It's the city and the county's job. They both fund. The county funds more, but the city is funding $40 to $50 million a year. That $375 million a year budget for the joint office is about $40 to $50 million from the city, probably about $80 or $90 million from the county, and then the rest is that supportive housing services tax that we have. And so it really is a joint city-county partnership, but it's gotten so political that people, it's like city versus the county now. And it's like, no, it's the joint office, you all. Like, I don't understand it. And so there are people within the city and the county that are supportive. And then there are folks who say things like, well, there's already money in our community for Housing First. We need more shelter. And we try to show them the data, and we try to talk to them about survival mode, and they just won't listen. So I think that's where you all can really go lean in and try to educate and push them in the direction of using these data-driven, evidence-based solutions that work around the country and around the world. What else, you all?
Did they spend all the money last year?
That's a great question. They have spent all of the money, and they are patting themselves on the back for that right now. But the thing is, they don't have an overarching plan or a strategy or a theory of change or a strategic direction. They're just like throwing the money out, and Path Home has gotten some of that money, and our partner agencies have gotten some of that money, and that's great, but it needs to be like a coordinated plan. Instead of just spend all the money, we need to spend the money in a way that works, and in a way that we're getting the outcomes that we want and what they're really funding. So the difference between an output and an outcome. An output is just the like shelter bed nights or number of food boxes. It's a count of services provided, but it's not the change that you see in people. Outcomes are the change that people go through as a result of the outputs. We as a community, the joint office funds the outputs. They don't even think about the outcomes. And so yes, they spent all their money on a whole bunch of outputs. Did it get the change that our community wants? Do you all see less people on the streets? Do you all see less trash on the streets? Like, no, right? It's still the same amount because we're not tracking our outcomes and we're not investing in things that make change.
Are you going to try to provide all those services in that third building yourself, or are you going to do it through other agencies? And if so, who are the ones you work with?
Great question. We will not provide all those services ourselves. We believe that we do a few things really well, what we talked about tonight, the shelter, prevention, and housing work. That's where Path Home is an expert. We will turn to our partner organizations that are experts in those other fields. So for mental health care, we'll work with Morrison Child and Family Services and places like Fora Health and Bridges to Change and New Narrative. They'll do our kind of behavioral health care work. For domestic violence advocacy, we'll partner with Raphael House of Portland and Self-Enhancement Inc., which is SEI. For employment training, we'll partner with the DPI Group and Oregon Tradeswomen. And for child care, we're hoping to partner with a Montessori preschool that can come in and do Montessori-style education for the kiddos that are in the child care. Great question.
I've been to a couple mayor things, and it was a business owner, a small business owner that hosted it. So the candidate was very much about, okay, we want to get, the streets kind of livable and the tourists and your customers coming, feeling comfortable coming out of Portland. So shelter with services, but we do eventually want housing. So there's sort of this like interim step, and I totally get like, hey, if we settle for shelters, that's all we get. But I also get like, if it's going to take so long, all the NIMBY, all of the things regulations we're going to have to fight. Like, when is that shelter step workable and helpful?
Yeah, shelter can certainly be a helpful part of the continuum. I'm not anti-shelter. We run a beloved shelter, right? But what we have to do is we have to make sure that there is a pathway out of shelter, that people are not staying 12, 18, even 24. I've heard of people staying 30 months in a shelter. That is, at that point, think about if we're paying $3,000 or $4,000 per month for that shelter stay for that individual, that's $36,000 or $48,000 that we're spending just on shelter for a couple of years. So there has to be a pathway out. That is like the most important piece. And we need to minimize the time that people are in shelter. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, sure. But anything longer than 6 months is just too long to keep people in that survival mode, where the longer they're in their survival mode, the more the brain is going to rewire the brain to always be in survival mode. So pathway out. Another piece is the trauma-informed side of things, both trauma-informed care from a programmatic lens, but also the trauma-informed design and architecture. Some of these shelters are just awful places to be in. And Path Home has run them, right? We ran a shelter on Northwest 16th and Northrop, one of the family winter shelters one year, where it was a warehouse with a concrete floor and warehouse ceiling and 75 cots in a room. We didn't have cubicles and partitions, and it wasn't this happy, sweet little place like Goose Hollow Family Shelter. It was a warehouse. We had 2 bathrooms, no showers. It was awful. And so we saw, that was the same year we moved to Family Village. So we were running this downtown or this Northwest shelter and Family Village at the same time. Same exact families coming to us from the Multnomah County Coordinated Entry, same exact staff, same exact organization, same exact rules and supervisors and all the things. And the difference in the behavior of the families was night and day. At the winter shelter, the parents are fighting, inside of a family. The parents are just tons of bordering on domestic violence, right? Tons of just inter-family or intra-family dynamics. And then inter-family, all the other families are fighting with each other. The kids are running around out of control. And you can't, there's 12 or 14 in a pack that are just going around and causing destruction. And no matter what you did, their parents couldn't control them. The staff couldn't control them. The staff was miserable, so unhappy. You would just walk into that shelter and be like, ooh, this is not good. And then you come over to Family Village, and it's the exact opposite. The kids are playing with each other. The parents are engaging with each other. They're taking classes together. They're watching each other's kids. They're going grocery shopping together. The staff are happy. There's no fighting. And it's okay, look at these 2 different situations. The only thing different is the building and the structure of the shelter. And so, we have this firsthand experience to show that when you are not in a trauma-informed environment, you're in survival mode. You're acting out. You are just fight, flight, or freeze all the time. And almost all of so we are the only night shelter that has trauma-informed design. Rose Haven Day Shelter also has trauma-informed design, and that place is gorgeous as well. But none of the other shelters have trauma-informed design. And so people are going in them, and the trauma is just getting worse. There was a woman I was talking to who stayed at one of the congregate women's shelters. And, you're going to get upset when I tell you this. She said from 9 p.m. until 7 a.m., you are not allowed to leave your 5x7 square where your cot is. She's an older woman. She has incontinence issues. I'm sure some of us can identify with this. She wet herself one evening, and they wouldn't let her get up and go to the bathroom to change her clothes. So she had to sleep there in that cot all night long in her wet clothes. This is the environment that our shelters are in. And so then she was like, I did not ever go back to that shelter. I left, and when outreach workers came and asked me on the streets, will you go into a shelter? No, I'm not going into a shelter. So then she's marked as service resistant. She's choosing to be homeless. And she says, I'm not choosing to be homeless, but I'm also choosing not to go into that shelter that strips my dignity from me and makes me feel like a second-class citizen. And so these are the kinds of environments, like shelter like that. No, we should not have shelter like that. She was in one of the Safe Rest villages after that, where she was told, you are not allowed to talk to your neighbors. Don't look at them, don't talk to them, don't be friends with them, don't have conversations with them. And she was prohibited from having any relationships with the other 30 people that were in that Safe Rest village. This is the environment that people are in. So when I say trauma-informed design, it doesn't need to look like Beautiful Family Village. It just has to give a basic level of dignity and safety and privacy. And so shelter, when it does those things, can be really, really helpful as long as there's that pathway out. Yeah.
When you say safe rest villages, are those the little white pods? How could those be arranged in a trauma-informed way?
Well, that's a great question. Those are one of the most expensive interventions we have. Those are the ones that cost $4,000 per month per pod. So it's hugely expensive. I say that for me, the base level is they have to have electricity, plumbing, insulation, and privacy, a locked door. And so those little pods, they're not constructed well, they get mold, they leak, they're not insulated, they're not good places to be. People have had a really hard time. The folks that I have talked to, like this woman, MJ, that have stayed in them have not had positive experiences. I think it would be better to not pay $4,000 per pod and instead rent a $4,000 apartment and help those folks live with dignity in an apartment. That would be my answer. And I know that's controversial. It shouldn't be, but I think it is.
Brandi? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you, and then we'll come over to you. Go for it, Bob.
So from an advocacy standpoint, you obviously we're in election season, so that's a thing. You mentioned budget season. Is there a source of information you can recommend where we can keep up with this stuff that's going on? Where are the pressure points and when?
Yeah, so the Multnomah County board meetings are where all of those conversations happen. And if you either just watch, they're all on Zoom, you can go there in person on Hawthorne. They're really, I think, a great place to go. Also, you could sign up for the Joint Office on Homeless Services email list. They do an email. A lot of it is bragging about the results that they have, which I think is probably a bad look. But they also have all the information about opportunities to come to community meetings. All the budget information is in there. So really, I would say the Multnomah County Board and then the Joint Office on Homeless Services would be the two best places. And if you ever have questions, reach out. Please, I am a resource to all of you. If you are like, hey, you said budget was happening in the spring. What is that happening? Just email me and I'll be able to point you in the right direction. You want to go next?
Sorry. So, Commissioner Jones-Dixon, do you have any knowledge of this gentleman?
Yeah,
Okay.
he's a Gresham City Councilor.
Okay.
And he's running for Multnomah County, one of the Multnomah County District 4, I think.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have a meet and greet with him coming up this week, and so I'm curious to know if you know much about how his thoughts and feelings are regarding homelessness, some of his,
Yeah, I think he,
keep in mind that I can just kind of
for sure, I think he really gets it. I have a lot of respect for him. I think he does get it, but I think you can ask him things like, what's your feeling on housing first? What should be our community's overarching plan to address homelessness? If you have a plan, Jones-Dixon, then how much housing will it create, or how many people will be moved into housing, how quickly, and how fast will people be connected to services?
I'm going to follow up with you.
Please, please. I have them all written out. I'll just copy and paste for you. Yeah, Carrie.
Can you talk about what are some red flags we should look for if we're listening to elected officials? Like, how do we know this person has not drank the Kool-Aid or done their homework, or they're trying to divert people's attention away from real solutions? Like,
Yep.
what do we need to listen for?
I think that's a great question, Carrie. And so what I would say probably is ask folks, what is your approach to I guess what would be a red flag to me, rather than a question, what would be a red flag? I think the whole, I don't know if you all have followed the Keith Wilson shelter Portland thing. He believed that in 1 year we can create enough shelter to shelter everybody, and that we'll be able to get rid of unsheltered homelessness in Portland by creating about 2,500 or 3,000 shelter. Well, we know that there are 6,300 individuals who experience homelessness, plus 10,000 kids and parents who experience homelessness. Your 2,500 shelter beds are not going to do anything. But what I think is behind the thinking there is there's this rule out there that maybe you have heard of, that unless a community has somewhere that everyone without housing can go, you can't make camping illegal. It's called like time and place restrictions or something like that. You can restrict where they are during certain times and places, but you can't say we have a camping ban, because people don't have other places to go for life-sustaining activities, sleeping and eating and going to the bathroom and stuff like that. And so what I think is behind this plan is, let's say we have enough shelter beds for everybody to go to, and then we can ban camping, criminalize homelessness, get a whole bunch of people now dealing with the criminal justice system in addition to not having a home. And so I think it's this kind, if you can try to peel back, like if that's their motive, that's the biggest red flag to me, is that your motive is not to end homelessness for people. Your motive is to be able to create a camping ban so that you can criminalize homelessness and make a lot of people's lives a whole lot worse. I am for not having camping in our community, but I want people to be able to go to housing. For sure. And then I would say too, anytime you hear shelter first, the words shelter first, I'm a shelter first advocate. Again, that is not a thing. And I just feel like when the conversation is focused on shelter, how many people does shelter end homelessness for? 0. Right? And so if we're talking about ending homelessness, shelter's just not going to do it unless we have that pipeline out of shelter. The other challenge that comes with something like Keith Wilson's plan, we only have, I mean, it's a lot of money, but we only have $375 million a year. When I say that out loud, that sounds ridiculous because that's so much money, but that's what we have each year. So New York City is a place that's looked at because New York City has a right to shelter. If you are a person or a family in New York City and you do not have a house or a home, the city of New York is required to produce a shelter for you so that you have somewhere to sleep indoors. What has happened in New York is called right to shelter. What has happened there is that New York is sheltering 70,000 people per night. There is no money in their homeless continuum services for housing because it's all going to shelter. And so you think, oh, right to shelter, that sounds like a great thing. We want everyone to have shelter, but it drains all of the resources in a community and only can provide shelter as opposed to being able to provide a whole array of homeless services. Yeah.
I looked at your website and was amazed at the total operation of Path Home. Could you just give an overview, your budget last year, the number of families you helped, and the size of your staff?
Yeah, great question. So believe it or not, Path Home has almost 50 staff these days. When I started here in 2007, there were 4 of us. And we were all part-time, including me, and our total budget was $78,000 a year. And we did a lot with that $78,000 a year. So today our budget is about $6 million a year. We have about 50 staff, and we're helping over 550 families a year, about 1,500 kids and parents. About half of our funding comes from the Joint Office on Homeless Services, and the other half comes from private resources, from foundations and individual donors. And that's a really intentional business model that we've created over the years because it's really hard to get government resources for homeless services, and we really wanted to insulate ourselves from some of that volatility that comes with those government dollars. So we have this business model that half of our income comes from private sources. We still rely on a huge team of volunteers. We have over 300 volunteers who come each year, provides multiple staff positions for free. So yeah, that's Path Home.
Amazing.
Thank you. Any last questions?
Excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. Well, I am so grateful for all of you. I feel like in the last couple years, and I think a lot of that's due to Karen's leadership, I have just felt so much more connected to you all, and I feel like Path Home and FUMC just have this great partnership going on right now, and I'm so grateful for all of you. I am here as a resource. If you're going to a candidate forum and you want to just have a 10-minute psych up conversation, or you want talking points, or you want anything, please, I am here as a resource, and I'm going to rely on you all to help us end homelessness in Portland. So, thank you.